Malcolm X stood at a crossroads that would redefine the Black freedom struggle in America. When he publicly announced his break from the Nation of Islam, many assumed his voice would fade. Instead, it grew sharper, broader, and more dangerous to those invested in the status quo. This was not a retreat, it was a strategic beginning. Malcolm made it clear that his mission was no longer limited by religious boundaries. His focus shifted toward the millions of Black Americans who were still searching for dignity, security, and real power in a society built on exclusion. At the heart of this moment was a bold idea. True liberation could not come from imitation, patience, or empty promises. It required independent thinking, honest analysis, and the courage to build something new. Malcolm called on students, workers, and everyday people to study their condition deplito, stop accepting inherited explanations, and start developing their own strategies. He believed freedom demanded clarity, self-respect, and unity grounded in shared experience, not surface-level inclusion. This shift marked one of the most important turning points of his life. No longer confined to a single organization, Malcolm began connecting the Black American struggle to global movements for independence and human dignity. His message was unsettling because it stripped away comforting illusions and replaced them with responsibility. He challenged people to ask difficult questions. Who defines freedom? Who benefits from delay? And what does it truly mean to stand on your own feet? This story is not just about a man who changed direction, it's about a voice that refused to be softened. A voice that urged people to think, to organize, and to believe in their own worth. As we dive into this powerful chapter, you'll see why his words still resonate today. If you value stories that explore history, truth, and powerful ideas, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. As Malcolm X moved forward from his break with the Nation of Islam, his message became clearer and more uncompromising. Not because it was driven by anger, but because it was rooted in observation and lived experience. He asked people to look beyond labels that had long divided the Black community and confront a deeper truth. The suffering faced by Black Americans, he explained, was not caused by differences in faith or ideology. It did not matter whether one prayed in a church, a mosque, or not at all. The treatment remained the same. What defined their position in society was race. And until that reality was acknowledged, no meaningful solution could be built. Malcolm often described this reality in terms that ordinary people could immediately understand. He spoke of waiting, of patience demanded by those who were never asked to endure the consequences of delay. Gradual reform sounded reasonable only to those who were comfortable. For communities living under constant pressure, harassment, exclusion, and humiliation, time itself became a burden. Each promise of progress that arrived slowly felt disconnected from the urgency of daily life. Malcolm argued that asking people to wait calmly while their conditions remained unchanged was not a strategy for justice, but a method of control. What made his words unsettling was not their tone, but their honesty. He refused to dress injustice in polite language or pretend that symbolic gestures were the same as real change. To Malcolm, reforms that looked impressive on paper meant little if they failed to alter how people lived, moved, and were treated from one day to the next. He challenged the idea that suffering could be measured against a future reward, insisting instead that dignity was not something to be postponed. It was a right that existed in the present moment. This perspective connected naturally to his growing independence. Free from organizational boundaries, Malcolm spoke directly to the realities many preferred not to name. He pointed out how systems of power benefited from keeping the conversation focused on appearances rather than outcomes. As long as discussions revolved around surface-level harmony, the deeper structures that maintained inequality remained untouched. By shifting the focus from religious or cultural difference to race-based injustice, Malcolm reframed the struggle in a way that could not be easily dismissed or delayed. His insistence on urgency did not come from a rejection of peace, but from a rejection of false peace. He understood that stability without fairness was fragile, and that calm built on inequality was temporary by nature. For Malcolm, real progress required confronting uncomfortable truths and accepting that transformation would not come simply through time or goodwill. It would come through awareness, organization, and a willingness to demand results that could be felt, not just announced. In this stage of his journey, Malcolm X was not calling for chaos, but for clarity. He was asking people to stop confusing patience with progress and to recognize that justice loses its meaning when it is endlessly deferred. By naming race as the central issue and rejecting slow reform as an adequate response to persistent injustice, he reshaped the conversation entirely. His message pushed people to see their condition as it was, not as it was promised to become. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for a more direct and honest struggle for human dignity. As Malcolm X continued redefining his mission, his journey carried him far beyond the borders of the United States, and what he witnessed abroad reshaped the way he understood struggle, power, and possibility. So his travels to Africa and his pilgrimage to Mecca were not symbolic gestures or personal milestones alone. They became living classrooms that exposed a contrast impossible to ignore. While Black Americans were still debating access, recognition, and delayed promises, entire nations of African people had already torn down colonial rule and stood before the world as independent states. In Africa, Malcolm saw countries that had once endured open domination now raising their own flags, forming their own governments, and speaking for themselves on the global stage. These nations were not free of problems, but they possessed something Black Americans were still denied: collective authority over their own destiny. Their independence was not granted gradually through polite negotiation. It was claimed through organization, unity, and an unshakable demand for self-determination. For Malcolm, this reality raised a painful question. How could people thousands of miles away, once under direct colonial control, gain recognition as full human beings faster than Black citizens living in a country that celebrated freedom as its highest value? Mecca further expanded this realization. There, Malcolm encountered people of African descent who were not defined by inferiority, suspicion, or exclusion. He saw Black men and women treated with dignity, not as a problem to be managed, but as equals participating in a shared human experience. This exposure did not erase his understanding of racism, but it challenged the narrow frame through which Black struggle had long been viewed in America. It became clear to him that the issue was not simply one of civil rights within a single nation, but of human rights recognized across the world. This global perspective unified the ideas he had already been developing. The urgency he spoke of, the rejection of delay, and the insistence on clarity now fit into a larger pattern. Around the world, oppressed people were no longer asking for inclusion within unjust systems. They were asserting their right to exist with dignity on their own terms. Malcolm began to see that Black Americans were not an isolated case, but part of a broader human story of resistance against domination and denial. What made this realization powerful was its implication. By framing the Black American struggle as a human rights issue, Malcolm lifted it beyond domestic debate and moral persuasion. Human rights, unlike civil rights, could not be confined to national boundaries or postponed through political compromise. They carried international weight, moral urgency, and historical precedent. Colonized nations had appealed to the world and forced recognition, not by waiting patiently, but by making injustice visible and undeniable. This shift did not soften Malcolm's message. It sharpened it. He understood that once a struggle is seen as global, excuses lose their power. If independence was possible elsewhere, then continued inequality at home could no longer be justified as complexity or gradual progress. It became a matter of will. His travels confirmed what he had long suspected, that liberation does not arrive through permission, but through pressure applied with unity and purpose. By connecting Black America's condition to global movements for independence, Malcolm reframed the path forward. He was no longer speaking only to a nation that had failed to deliver on its promises, but to a world that had already witnessed what determined people could achieve. This perspective gave his message a new dimension, one rooted not in hope alone, but in evidence. It showed that freedom was not an abstract dream, but a reality already claimed by others who had refused to wait. As Malcolm X's vision expanded through global awareness, his critique of America grew sharper and more precise. He was no longer willing to accept comforting narratives that framed racial injustice as a misunderstanding or a tragic chapter safely sealed in the past. For Malcolm, history was not distant. It was active, shaping the present through structures, attitudes, and institutions that continued to define black life in America. Slavery, he argued, was not merely an unfortunate beginning that time had corrected. It was the foundation upon which modern inequality was built, and refusing to acknowledge that truth only allowed its consequences to persist. What disturbed Malcolm most was not ignorance, but denial. He observed how white America often celebrated ideals of freedom and equality while resisting any honest confrontation with how those ideals had been violated. The crime was not only in what had been done centuries earlier, but in the refusal to face its aftermath. By pretending that the damage had been repaired, society avoided responsibility for the conditions that still trapped millions. Malcolm insisted that reconciliation without truth was impossible, and that progress built on selective memory was fragile by design. This denial, he explained, had a practical function. It made injustice appear accidental rather than systemic. By framing inequality as the result of individual failure instead of historical design, power could shift blame onto the very people harmed by the system. Malcolm exposed how stereotypes played a central role in this process. Once a community is broadly portrayed as dangerous, unruly, or criminal, harsh treatment begins to look reasonable. Suspicion replaces empathy, and control is justified as protection. He pointed out that these narratives did not emerge spontaneously. They were cultivated through media, political language, and everyday assumptions that painted black neighborhoods as threats rather than communities. When fear became the dominant lens, enforcement followed naturally. Malcolm warned that once the public accepted these stereotypes, it created permission for excessive force and unchecked authority. Actions that would spark outrage elsewhere were dismissed or ignored when directed at people already labeled as problems. What made Malcolm's critique so unsettling was its clarity. He refused to separate social attitudes from institutional behavior. To him, stereotypes were not harmless opinions. They were tools that shaped policy, policing, and public response. When black people were seen first as suspects rather than citizens, their rights became conditional. This, he argued, was how systemic racism sustained itself without openly naming its intentions. His words were not aimed at provoking guilt, but awareness. Malcolm believed that real change required confronting the full scope of history, not just its convenient lessons. He challenged listeners to recognize that a nation cannot claim moral leadership while avoiding accountability for its foundations. Progress, in his view, demanded more than reforming laws. It required dismantling the stories that justified inequality in the first place. By connecting historical injustice to present-day enforcement, Malcolm drew a direct line that many preferred to ignore. He showed how the past lived on through patterns of suspicion, surveillance, and control that shaped daily experience. His message was firm but focused. A society cannot heal from wounds it refuses to examine. As long as denial remained, so would the conditions it protected. In this stage of his journey, Malcolm X was not simply condemning the past. He was illuminating the present. He challenged America to see itself clearly, without myth or comfort, and to understand that justice begins not with forgetting, but with remembering honestly. As Malcolm X confronted history, power, and global inequality, he turned his attention inward to something just as critical: identity. He understood that oppression was not sustained by laws and institutions alone, but also by the quiet damage done to the way people saw themselves. Long before chains were removed, a deeper captivity had taken root, shaping names, language, and self-perception. Malcolm believed that liberation could never be complete if people continued to define themselves through labels created to diminish them. He spoke often about the term Negro, not as a simple word, but as a symbol of erasure. To Malcolm, it represented a category imposed during slavery, one that stripped people of history and reduced them to a social condition rather than a human lineage. It was not a neutral description, but a reminder of exclusion from political, economic, and cultural power. By questioning this term, he was not engaging in semantics. He was challenging an entire framework that normalized invisibility and dependence. This same logic extended to surnames. Malcolm urged people to consider what it meant to carry names inherited from those who once claimed ownership over their ancestors. These names, he argued, were not marks of identity but records of possession. They linked generations to a past defined by control rather than choice. By rejecting them, Malcolm was not asking people to abandon history, but to confront it honestly and refuse to let it define the future. His own adoption of X symbolized the unknown identities stolen by slavery and the right to reclaim what had been taken. Yet Malcolm understood that changing names alone was not enough. The deeper struggle lay in dismantling internalized self-doubt. He spoke directly to the quiet ways people had been taught to measure themselves against standards that excluded them. From appearance to culture, generations had absorbed messages that suggested worth was something to be borrowed rather than owned. Malcolm challenged this conditioning by insisting that dignity was not granted externally. It was something to be recognized and defended from within. His emphasis on self-respect was not rooted in vanity, but in survival. A people who doubt their own value, he believed, are easier to control, divide, and dismiss. By restoring pride in identity, Malcolm aimed to rebuild a foundation strong enough to support collective action. He reminded listeners that confidence was not arrogance, and self-respect was not hostility. It was simply the refusal to accept definitions imposed by those who benefited from their absence. This focus on identity tied seamlessly into his broader vision. Just as he rejected gradual reform and denial of history, he rejected any freedom that required self-erasure. Independence, in his view, demanded clarity about who you are and where you come from. Without that clarity, unity would remain fragile, easily disrupted by fear or approval seeking. Malcolm believed that when people stood firmly in their own identity, they could engage the world without apology or dependence. His message resonated because it addressed a wound many felt but rarely named. He was not offering comfort through reassurance, but strength through truth. By encouraging people to reclaim their names, their image, and their sense of worth, Malcolm reframed identity as an act of resistance. It was a declaration that history, no matter how painful, did not have the final say. In this phase of his journey, Malcolm X made it clear that freedom was not only about external change. It was about restoring what had been systematically stripped away: confidence, dignity, and the right to define oneself. Without that restoration, any victory would be incomplete. With it, the path toward genuine liberation became not only possible, but inevitable. As Malcolm X brought his message to its sharpest edge, his call for freedom by any means necessary was often misunderstood as a rejection of peace, when in truth it was a rejection of helplessness. He was not speaking from a place of recklessness, but from a clear-eyed assessment of reality. History, as he saw it, offered no examples of dignity preserved through silence alone. When institutions designed to protect instead failed, and when promises repeatedly collapsed into delay, Malcolm argued that people had both the right and the responsibility to protect their lives, their families, and their future. At the center of this belief was unity. Malcolm insisted that division weakened any struggle, especially when that division distracted from a shared condition. Differences in religion, background, or ideology mattered less than the common experience of exclusion and vulnerability. He urged people to recognize that strength did not come from standing alone, but from standing together with purpose. Unity, in his vision, was not emotional agreement, but coordinated resolve grounded in self-respect and mutual responsibility. Self-defense, as Malcolm framed it, was not about seeking conflict. It was about refusing to accept harm as normal. He believed that respect could not grow where fear was allowed to operate unchecked. When a community is consistently left unprotected, he argued, asking it to remain passive is not a moral request, but an unrealistic one. Malcolm challenged the idea that endurance alone equaled virtue, insisting instead that survival required awareness, preparation, and the courage to draw clear boundaries. This perspective fits seamlessly with everything he had said before. His rejection of gradual reform, his global understanding of human rights, his exposure of historical denial, and his emphasis on identity all led to this conclusion. Freedom, in his view, was not something to be granted by those who benefited from its absence. It was something to be claimed through unity, clarity, and action aligned with reality. He believed that once people understood their worth, they would no longer accept explanations that justified their suffering. Malcolm's words continue to resonate because they confront uncomfortable questions that remain unresolved. What happens when laws exist, but protection does not? What does justice mean when it is promised but unevenly applied? His answers were not designed to comfort, but to awaken. He asked people to see themselves as active participants in history, not passive recipients of its outcomes. Though his life was cut short, Malcolm X left behind more than powerful speeches. He left a framework for thinking clearly under pressure, for valuing dignity over approval, and for understanding that freedom without security is incomplete. His message reminds us that real change has always required courage, honesty, and collective effort. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on this story. If you found value in exploring these ideas and understanding their relevance today, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more thoughtful content that examines history, identity, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. Identity.